Um, so, hi all. Today is my honor to host, our honor to host Professor David Laibson of Harvard University. Among many other things, David is the leading expert on intertemporal choices and financial management. So, if you want to improve your finance, listen carefully. Actually, those who listened carefully till now already have one great tip. Just live on campus, you will save a lot of money. David also serves as a student's dean, so if you plan to apply as a student to Harvard, be polite to David. David, the floor is yours. You have about 45 minutes.
Great. Thanks, everyone. It's a pleasure to be joining you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to your seminar. So I'm going to talk today about, if we have time, 3 papers, and they're going to draw together the following phenomena that exist in the world of present bias. And I want to kind of give you an overview of the mechanisms that the literature is uncovering in this present biased economy. So we'll see that we see binding liquidity constraints as a common feature in these models. We'll see that liquid assets tend to be vanishing in this economy, meaning consumers have a hard time holding them on their balance sheet. They spend them down quickly. We'll see that consumers are willing to borrow at very high borrowing costs. We'll see that when consumers get liquidity, they tend to spend it relatively quickly. We'll see that while nudges work, there are forces in the present biased economy that cause those nudges to be undone over the medium run, so that short run efficacy is misleading in the nudge world. Long run non-efficacy will be a factor that one wants to watch out for. And if we have time, we'll get to a third paper where we'll see that the optimal kind of regulation in an economy like this is not nudges. It's going to be hard paternalism. But that is an overview. Let's now turn to the 3 papers that I'll try to quickly go through. First, there's a paper with Peter Maxted and Ben Moll, which is a kind of simulation of a household or a population of households. In that world, we'll see liquidity constraints, low levels of liquid assets, high borrowing costs, and a high marginal propensity to consume, all coming into the equilibrium analysis. In a second paper, co-authored with John Bashairs and James Choi and Peter Maxted again, we'll look at nudges that seem to work, but we'll see that that efficacy is temporary because the present bias forces that make the nudges work in the first place actually undo the nudges in the medium run. And then finally, in a paper with John Bashairs, James Choi, Chris Clayton, Chris Harris, and Bridget Madrian, we'll begin to think a bit about what kind of paternalism is optimal in a world like this. Okay, so the first paper is with Peter Maxted and Ben Moll, and we're going to make a lot of standard assumptions and then make one non-familiar assumption or one unusual assumption. So the standard assumptions are to model the economy with a heterogeneous population of agents with a lot of rich institutional factors that are designed to be a good match to what we see out there in the environment that households face. So we'll have stochastic income, we'll have stochastic interest rates, we'll have stochastic life cycle events, we'll have assets in the form of liquid wealth and illiquid housing, we'll have liquidity constraints, you can only borrow so much, we'll have liabilities in the form of credit card debt, and in this case, mortgages that you take out at a fixed rate and then refinance if you want to when interest rates change. The novel element in this framework will be that rather than using standard exponential discounting functions, we'll use a naive present biased discount function. And what I'm going to tell you wouldn't really change if we went to a sophisticated case, but for various reasons, we're going to talk today about the naive case. The evidence probably points more to naive agents than to sophisticated agents, though probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle. Okay, there's a related literature on consumption and saving and behavioral biases, and also we'll be doing this in continuous time. And there's a set of methods that have been developed recently that enable us to do that. Okay, so here's the basic model. We're going to have stochastic income, YT, which will evolve according to a Markov process. So it'll be a certain level and then flip to a different level and then randomly flip to a different level. You'll have liquid wealth, B sub T. You'll have a house with value H, and you'll have a mortgage with time varying value M sub T. It's varying in its value because of refinancing and because you're paying it off. So the key dynamic budget constraint here is given by that first equation. The derivative of your liquid assets, B, is the time derivative is given by your flow income, which is Y sub T, the interest you pay or the interest you get on your liquid holdings. But if you hold debt so that B is negative, then in fact, you're going to pay a wedge omega CC for credit card, which is the extra interest rate that you pay, or the extra interest you pay because you're borrowing on a credit card. And then, of course, you give away some interest payments on your mortgage, and you also give away some principal payments on your mortgage. And finally, we have the consumption, critically, that you're consuming on a flow basis. So this equation represents the dynamic budget constraint for the household. In addition, the household is going to be paying down their mortgage. I mentioned that earlier. So we can just write that in the second equation as M dot equals minus psi M. That's the principal repayment. There'll be a liquidity constraint in this economy. Your liquid assets must be greater than or equal to some lower bound, B lower bar. That might be, let's say, a third of your annual income. So you can borrow as much as a third of your annual income in a non-collateralized way, say on a credit card. You'll also be constrained in how much mortgage debt you can take out. Your mortgage debt must be less than or equal to theta times the value of your house. And that'll typically be, just to anticipate, in the US, that would be 0.8. You can borrow up to 80% of the value of your house. As I said earlier, households can discreetly adjust their balance sheet by refinancing their mortgage. They'll do that from time to time. They'll procrastinate in doing that because they're present biased. They'll want to delay the cost of doing it to later periods. Until then, they'll end up often carrying credit card debt when they'd be better off going ahead and refinancing, something they plan to do but put off doing for a fair amount of time. And then finally, interest rates will follow a Markov process. Think of this as like a 10-year treasury rate. So these are kind of long-run interest rates. And your mortgage rate will simply be equal to the economy's interest rate plus a wedge, omega superscript M. And obviously, if you have a high mortgage rate and interest rates fall, you'll want to refinance. Okay, so we're going to be motivating our continuous time setting by starting in discrete time. So with present bias, we've got a standard exponentially discounted utility function with one difference. Rather than just having the delta factor exponentiated with the horizon S, we additionally have this uniform downweighting of utils, beta, where beta has a value well below 1. We'll see values here of around 0.7, 0.8. In typical estimates of beta, depending upon the population, you end up with estimates somewhere between 0.5 and 0.9. We'll be studying the naive case where the current self believes counterfactually that future selves will be time consistent, but of course that's a mistake because future selves will also be present biased. Now, rather than doing this in discrete time, it'll turn out that there are continuous time methods that make all of this much easier. So anyone out there who's modeling this sort of stuff, I recommend that you go to continuous time. Turns out mathematically, these models are much better behaved. And all that we're going to do to achieve that is to take the time period length and let it go to 0. If you want to see the kind of mathematical micro foundations for this, take a look at the Harrison-Laibson paper 2013. But essentially, you can just think of the discrete time model with time periods that are getting shorter and shorter. And it turns out that once you go to a horizon of periods that last as long as a month, you might as well have periods that are instantaneously long. So the mathematics are such that whether you model periods as being a month or 2 weeks or a day or an hour, you get the same mathematical result in terms of the policy functions in these economies. Now, why continuous time? I mentioned before, you're going to be getting the benefits of tractability. So these models are much easier to solve and generate much more regularized policy functions when you work in continuous time. And if you're interested, happy to talk about that, but that's a kind of technical aside. So here's the model summary. We have 6 state variables. We have liquid wealth, which when it's negative represents credit card debt. So when B is positive, you're holding liquid assets. When B is negative, you're borrowing on your credit card. We have stochastic labor income, Y, which follows a Markov process. That's a flow variable, which will be discretely moving around depending upon your labor market status. We have your mortgage, which pins down your illiquid home equity. H is fixed, so H minus M is your home equity. We have the mortgage rate that you're paying, R superscript M, and we have the market interest rate, R, and we have an effort cost to refinance your mortgage. The household is continuously making 2 decisions. It's continuously choosing flow consumption, which is that C that we studied before, and then it's also continuously deciding whether to make a discrete decision and do one of these mortgage refis, where it can either just change the interest rate or do a cash out in addition, or do a pay down where it discretely pays down its mortgage. So this will be happening with a kind of stopping problem formalism, and it will be happening every now and then. By contrast, consumption is a flow variable. So you're just continuously choosing your flow consumption C.
Can you explain to psychologists, give example for psychologists among us, what is an example of situation in which you should refinance your mortgage in a simple way?
So sure. So imagine that I took out a mortgage at an interest rate of 5%, and then mortgage interest rates fall. And now I can get a mortgage in principle. I don't have it yet, but I could get it at 2%. So interest rates have gone down. I have a mortgage at 5, but if I go back to my bank and refinance my mortgage, I could get a mortgage of 2. Now, I don't want to do that the second interest rates fall below 5% because of an option value problem that I face. So I'll wait till interest rates fall far enough and then I'll refinance a mortgage. So in Israel, does it work that way where if you're
in Israel, but maybe someone know better than me, but in Israel, we have this prime, right? This funny thing that you take mortgage that is conditioned on when the interest rate goes down, your mortgage automatically change.
Right. So you have a variable rate mortgage system then.
Yeah.
So
but our mortgage consists of a few parts. One of them is
only
usually,
part of it, yes.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Only part of it has this nice feature that you don't have to refinance with. We understand.
Right. Okay.
So you
great.
have to refinance in Israel as well. You don't have to, but you can.
Oh, I see. There is an analog in Israel, even though part of your mortgage is variable. Okay. So it's not really completely a variable rate mortgage. It's like a partially variable rate mortgage, apparently.
Yes.
Okay.
You can take up to 67% variable mortgage.
Oh, I see. Okay. So you've got a hybrid. Great.
Yes.
So what we're modeling here is one where the variable portion of your mortgage is 0%. Okay, great. So we're going to really focus your attention, for lack of time, because I want to get through all 3 papers, on 2 cases. First, there's the rational benchmark, where the present bias parameter is 1. That's exponential discounting, and there'll be no procrastination in mortgage refinancing. And then we'll look at the full present bias case, where beta is less than 1, and that's going to affect all of your choices, including your propensity to refinance your mortgage. And here you'll be a procrastinator when it comes to mortgage refinancing. There's an intermediate case if you're interested. I won't talk about it today. It's the case where we allow beta to be less than 1, but we prevent you from procrastinating on mortgage refinancing. It's a kind of artificial case. It's more for conceptual clarity about what contributes to the outcomes in the paper. I'm going to skip over that and focus your attention on 1 and 3. Okay, so we're going to now calibrate the model. The key variables that I want to focus your attention on are the level of your home value. We'll be studying homeowners in this particular analysis today. Your home will be worth 3 times your annual income. So 3.1 is a ratio with respect to your income, or average income, let's say. You can borrow up to 80% of your home value. You can also hold credit card debt up to 1/3 of your income. So B can be as low as -1/3. And again, that's all with respect to average income, just like the value of the illiquid asset, the home is with respect to average income. And then we have the interest rates. And relative to the kind of rate at which the government borrows, you get to borrow, if you go out and get a mortgage today, at an interest rate that's 1.7 percentage points above the government's borrowing rate. And that's if you offer a collateralized borrowing framework where you're borrowing to buy a home. But if you're just borrowing on a credit card, then you have to pay 10.3 percentage points above the government rate. And naturally, credit card debt is not collateralized, so it has a much higher rate of interest. And this is all calibrated to US data. Okay, so let's begin by looking at the actual data, and then we'll start talking about models. So if we think about the empirical data in the US, and we think about the loan to value ratio, so that's the ratio of your mortgage loan to the value of your home, the average family has a loan to value ratio of 54%. So in the cycle of buying a home, taking out a mortgage, repaying the mortgage, buying a new home, paying down the mortgage, refinancing, all of those stochastic events, on average, households have a loan to value ratio of 54% of their mortgage. On average, they're holding credit card debt equal to 9% of their annual income. And that's debt on which they're paying interest. So that's a lot of debt at a pretty high rate of interest. Most advisors would say that's too much debt, but the reality is a majority of US households are carrying credit card debt on which they're paying interest, and it's not a trivial amount. It tends to be, on average, a large amount. And when we estimate, so that's kind of what the data says. Now let's go to the models. And we're going to focus on the exponential case and the present bias case. So in the exponential case, we are fixing beta equal to 1. So that's just a restriction. And then we estimate what long run discount rate, rho is the long run discount rate, is going to fit the data that I've just shown you. And the discount rate that works is, in order to fit this number, the loan to value ratio, is a discount rate of 1.47% or 1.5% per year, which means that you're discounting utils or well-being a year from now 1.5% relative to utils today, and you're discounting utils 2 years from now 3% relative to today. So it's a pretty low discount rate, and it's going to succeed in matching the loan to value ratio, but it's not going to succeed in matching the amount of credit card debt we have in the economy. These relatively patient households are so patient that their long run credit card debt will be pretty low, only 1/3 as much as the actual credit card debt that we see in the economy. So if we're going to be able to explain both the large amount of credit card debt and people's willingness to pay down their mortgage and not just keep taking cash outs from their mortgage to pump up their current consumption, we're going to need more than the exponential benchmark. Let's go to the present bias benchmark. Here we have an additional degree of freedom. We have a beta parameter of 0.83, which means in this case, let's think about this as kind of a daily model. That means that utils today are worth 17% more to you than utils tomorrow. So over a very short span of time, a week, a day, you're discounting those utils by 17%, but over the long run, you're just discounting by 1%. So by the long run, I mean the annual discount rate as you go from year 5 to year 6, that's just a 1% discount rate. So you've got a very sharp rate of decline in the short run. 0.83 implies a 17% short run discount rate, but your long run discount rate is just 1%. And now we're able to explain both people's ability or willingness to pay down their mortgage debt. So they end up with only 54% loan to value ratio, but also a lot of credit card borrowing. And essentially, this beta parameter is going to be driving the credit card borrowing because you have a very low beta, meaning not equal to 1, equal to 0.83. You end up being very impatient relative to events in the very near future. So you're quite willing to borrow on a credit card. But because you have a long run discount rate of 0.97, and actually I'm realizing we do want to really highlight that beta here is a discount factor and rho is a discount rate, just in case that's unfamiliar notation. So beta tells me how much I weight utils that come in the near future. Rho tells me what my discount rate is as I discount things that are, let's say, many years away. So they're both part of my discounting framework, but they have different mathematical meanings. The key point is that I'm very impatient in the short run, that's beta, and I'm very patient over the long run. That's my rho that's not that far from 0. So let's now begin to think about what happens in economies like this when we drop money on households, as we did during the last recession, the pandemic recession. In the exponential model, when we drop money on households, they tend to spend at a rate of about 20% of the drop per year. And that rate is falling the further out we go. So if I drop $1,000, they're going to spend maybe 100 or 200 bucks of it, over the first year. And when we introduce present biased agents, these agents are very impatient. So when I drop money on their household, when I write them a check from the government, I get a lot more immediate consumption from that event. You see here that their short run propensity to spend is such that they're spending at a rate in the short run that if they were to keep that up, they would spend almost all of the money drop within the first year of having received the money drop. And that's a lot higher than it is for the exponential agents down here. So these present biased agents are much more likely to kind of take whatever you give them and spend it quickly. We can see that by normalizing everything so that the exponential case has a value of 1 as a normalization. We see the present biased agents are at a ratio of 5 times the exponential agents. Now, in the long run, the present biased agents actually fall below the exponential agents, but that's simply because they run out of money. So they can't spend in the long run because they've already spent it all down, and eventually the exponential agents get the upper hand. Now, what's going on in this economy? Let me show you 2 figures that kind of summarize the action. Do a quick time check so I make sure I'm okay. So the present biased agents in red, if I think about their liquid wealth, and I think about their propensity to consume, they have a very high propensity to consume wealth over a time period of just a quarter. So they're going to consume 60% of what I give them in just the first quarter after the receipt of those payments, if they're down here at a low level of liquid wealth, where a lot of them end up piling up. So I've got liquid wealth on the horizontal axis, and I've got their marginal propensity to consume on the vertical axis. By contrast, the exponential agents in black have a much lower marginal propensity to consume. They're much more willing to spread things out over long periods of time. And consequently, the black line is well below the red line. But there's a second effect that's worth highlighting, which is location in the liquid wealth distribution. Let's look now at, again, liquid wealth on the horizontal axis, and let's ask, where are people located in equilibrium in these economies? And the answer is that the present biased agents are piling up at their lower bound for liquid wealth. They're kind of living hand to mouth. They're living a life where they've got very little liquid wealth sitting around, and they're just up against that liquidity constraint. By contrast, the exponential agents in black, they're not hanging out down here at the minimum level of liquid wealth. There's a lot more mass for these agents over here at positive liquid wealth. And so what you see is that in the present biased world, not only do households with low liquid wealth have a high propensity to consume that liquid wealth, but in addition, the present biased agents tend to be concentrated down here at the lower bound of liquid wealth. And so these are households that are kind of living hand to mouth, living with very little liquid assets. Now, I want to go one step further, and for lack of time, I'm not going to take you through the full analysis of a sophisticated agent. I want to just show you one equation, which is, let's look at this first equation up here, which is what economists would call the Euler equation. And it turns out to generalize for these households that are present biased. And basically, in these equilibria, you find that this marginal propensity to consume is often very close to 1 for a lot of agents. And when it's very close to 1, that means this term goes away. And if we're thinking about households where consumption is relatively constant over time, then the term on the left and the term on the right are going to be the same, so I can cross them out. And so I end up with an equation that looks like this. So 1 equals R times beta delta. And here we're looking basically at a very short run interest rate and a very short run discount factor delta. This term here is going to be close to 1. And so we're basically looking at the interest rate that will apply for these households over a span of time that's short, let's say a week. Well, if beta is equal to a value like 0.8, then R will be equal to a value like 1.2. So what this means is that these households will be willing to borrow at a 20% weekly interest rate. And so you end up with households in these economies borrowing at outrageous rates of interest. That's a 20% interest rate every week. So, over a year, your total interest the total amount you'd owe after a year would be 1.2 to the 52nd power, which is obviously a crazy amount of money. So these households in the economy that we're describing have trouble with debt. And there's more and more evidence that that is a global phenomenon. There was just an article this morning in Business Week about how the microfinance industry has gone toxic by giving people loans at high rates of interest that are ruining their lives. This is exactly what we would expect in this present biased world. Okay, so what is this model illustrated that we've just kind of gone through quickly? A bunch of phenomena. Liquidity constraints matter. Agents are piling up near the boundary where they can't borrow anything more, their maximum level of borrowing. Whatever wealth they have tends to be held in their illiquid asset, here home equity. When you give them liquid wealth, they tend to have a very high propensity to consume out of that liquid wealth, a government check. When you give them more illiquid wealth, the MPC tends to be very low because they've got no way to spend illiquid wealth. They've got no liquid wealth to spend if they feel wealthier. They're carrying a lot of high cost credit. In the model that I just showed you, the credit card interest rate was only, let's say, 14% per year. But I just illustrated on the last slide that if they don't have access to a 14% loan, they'll borrow at much higher rates of interest. And we see that in the developing world. And that's the last point, that households will be willing to borrow at ridiculously high rates of interest if the competitive market didn't push down that interest rate by offering better opportunities. So that's paper one. Now there's a second paper, which essentially, in light of just thinking about time, I'm going to just summarize. If households are very prone to spend down whatever wealth they have, if they can get their hands on it, if it's at all liquid, then nudges that encourage wealth formation are not going to work. And why is that? Even if I get them to do some savings in the short run, in the long run, they're going to raid that wealth and spend it down. And they'll do that unless the penalties for raiding their wealth formation are very high. So what we see in models like this, the one that we just showed you, when we apply it to the world of household saving at employers, is that households tend to spend their savings shortly after they accumulate that savings and decades before they reach retirement. So let me just show you a kind of simulation of this using the model that we just described. So here's a world where households are moving into new jobs about every 5 years. So there's a kind of new job here, a new job here, a new job here, a new job here, et cetera. And that's typical in the US economy. People turn over jobs very frequently. The problem is at each job, they're being auto-enrolled into a savings scheme. And the problem is that when in red, they leave job one, they go out and they have a spending spree on what they were saving at job one. Because in the US, you're not required to hold on to that retirement savings until retirement. You can spend it before retirement. And that keeps happening at every job as they go through life until they finally reach a point where they're getting so desperate that they don't spend it all at the very end of life, and they do end up with a little bit of retirement savings. But even in retirement, in gray, they quickly spend down whatever they've accumulated during their working life. And so rather than having smoothed consumption, they end up having these waves of consumption that correspond to splurging what they've saved at the previous job as they move between jobs. And then when they reach into retirement, they end up having a much lower level of expenditure because they've basically spent their retirement savings long before they got to retirement. So in this world, nudges work because they are saving at each job, but then they're spending right after they leave the job. And so you end up with a world where nudges appear to work, but in practice, they're not working because the nudges are not locking in illiquid savings. So this paper and others like it are arguing that the systems where people can just be nudged and only nudged into doing the right thing aren't working that well. Because when you're present biased, even if you've accumulated some wealth, that wealth is going to be dissipated in a world where the wealth is not locked down. Now, let me ask you, in Israel, when you save money for retirement in a retirement savings plan, is that money liquid or illiquid? Are you allowed to spend it, or is it kind of locked in until you retire or become disabled?
Locked in, and we also have law, so you cannot just spend it before. So
yeah, so you're in good company. Most countries do it your way because they probably recognize the problem that I've just described. The US is, I think, almost unique in having these liquid retirement accounts where you can take the money out early and spend it, which is exactly what American households are doing.
Actually, it's a bit more complicated. So part of it is liquid, part of it is illiquid, but mostly it is supposed to be illiquid.
Let me tell you about one last paper, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'm trying to give you a kind of overview of this literature. This is a paper where we're trying to understand what the optimal level of liquidity would be. And we're building a very simple model, two-period model, to kind of illustrate these ideas. In the first period, your utility is given by theta, a Tayshock, times your utility function, which takes consumption as an argument. In the second period, retirement, you simply have a utility function, which takes consumption in retirement as its argument. The social planner would like to maximize this. Your Tayshock theta times your utility during working life plus the exponential discount factor delta multiplying utility in period 2 retirement. The household with present bias is nearly the same. The only difference is that they're discounting additionally the retirement utility with this additional factor beta. So what would a optimal policy look like in this world? We're going to assume that households have heterogeneous beta and that heterogeneity is not observed by the government. So the government doesn't know whether you're a low beta type or a high beta type. Maybe the government has to treat everyone equally. We can solve for the exact mechanism that is second best optimal in this economy. But what we find is that that complicated exact savings mechanism that achieves optimality subject to information asymmetries is essentially as good as a very simple two-account system, a lot like what you have in Israel, where one account is completely liquid and one account is completely illiquid. So a lot of different saving systems have this property. You'll have, let's say, an illiquid pension, Social Security in the US, required saving in Singapore. There's lots of names for this. We find that that system where your paycheck comes in two forms. One part of your paycheck is a completely liquid payout to you. One part of your paycheck is a completely illiquid piece of forced savings for retirement. And that system, that very simple system, essentially achieves social optimality, where the welfare loss is just 4/100ths of 1% of social wealth relative to a perfect mechanism that is finely calibrated to this economy. So the first lesson here is that this very simple two-account system, a completely liquid account and a completely illiquid account, essentially achieves social efficiency. Well, let me give you an intuition why, and then we'll stop. So we're studying a world where people's beta values have an enormous range. Some people are not present biased. Their beta equals 1. Some people are extremely present biased. Their beta equals 0.2. And I've ordered these types on this figure so that the beta equals 0.2 types are here in green at the bottom, and the beta equal 0.1 types are here in blue at the top. What I'm showing you on the vertical axis is people's well-being in this economy. The numbers are negative, it doesn't matter, it's just a utility function. So it's just about ordering their value, not whether it's plus or minus. Further down means worse off, further up means better off. What I'm showing you on the horizontal axis is the penalty for early withdrawal before retirement from the illiquid account. So what we're doing is varying the way society is set up. This is laissez-faire, where there's no penalty for withdrawals from the illiquid account. And this is a world like you have in Israel and Singapore and everywhere else, where the money in the illiquid account is completely illiquid. There's 100% penalty if you take the money out early, so you never would take it out early. Now, what I want to highlight first is that as we increase the penalty for early withdrawal from the illiquid retirement account, everyone is made better off. All these lines are upward sloping. Now, how is that even agents that have no self-control problems in blue at the top are made better off when I restrict their flexibility and I penalize them for withdrawing money from the illiquid account? And the answer is everyone's made better off for different reasons. These households down here are made better off because they need self-control. And unless I discourage them from spending, they're going to spend far too much when young and retire in poverty. These households are made better off because they're getting some of the benefits of the penalties that are paid by these households. So everyone is made better off as I increase the penalties away from 0. Now, eventually, these households in blue reach a peak. The penalties that they're getting that are being paid in by the households in green at the bottom begin to diminish as the pi 2 value gets higher, and those green households start paying fewer and fewer penalties because they are discouraged from making early withdrawals. And the blue households start to lose welfare. Their line begins to slope down. But you'll notice that where they end up at the end in blue is only slightly lower than where they started in blue at the beginning. So the households that have perfect self-control, that don't need any help in blue, are only made slightly worse off as we make the economy more and more illiquid with respect to retirement savings. So these households that have self-control, they're hurt, but they're barely hurt. By contrast, the households that don't have self-control in green and in purple, households with low beta values, they get enormous welfare gains by having a paternalistic society that protects their retirement saving. And so we end up in a world where the self-controlled households in blue are barely hurt by having paternalistic policies. But the households that have big self-control problems in green are greatly benefited by having illiquid assets. And so societally, it's optimal, if you take a utilitarian perspective, to move this economy to the right, because we get these enormous welfare gains for the households that don't have self-control, and only modest welfare declines for the households that do have self-control. And that's an example of something called asymmetric paternalism, which is an idea that Kammerer et al. Have developed a couple decades ago, where good policies can do a lot of good to those who have big behavioral biases and can only barely hurt in the right setting those who have limited or no behavioral biases. This is a kind of canonical example of asymmetric paternalism. Okay, so that ends that paper. And I've just kind of summarized this literature where we are right now. I'll just quickly wrap up. We see households that are living hand to mouth. We see households that have essentially no liquid assets. We see households that are paying very high costs of borrowing. We see households that are basically spending whatever money is handed to them. We see nudges that are only temporarily effective. And when we ask, what is optimal socially? The answer is not just a gentle nudge, but in fact, hard paternalism here in the form of illiquid assets. Okay, I'll stop there and open it up to all of you. Do I call you or do you just call yourselves because you can see your hands, whose hands are raised first?
I will try to help you, but you can manage it yourself and make my life easier.
Can I start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Kinneret.
So David, can you put your slides back?
Sure.
For the last figure with the betas and the nice green. So do you have any estimation about the type of people? So it might be that there are so many people in the green that it becomes even more and more important, right? Or it might be that most of the people have larger betas. So what do we know about the proportion of people? Again, it's a model, so it's not the. But according to this model, if you try to fit it to the general population, what is the distribution of betas?
So we know very little about that. There's a paper by Ben Lockwood that was published a year or two ago that summarizes the literature with respect to heterogeneity in beta. But I would say that our best guess, and I'm gonna, there's like 20 papers that look at this. They're all imperfect, but I'm going to kind of summarize them. Our best guess is that the average value of beta is about 0.6. And that, let's say that the beta values are, probably Gaussian. And I would say that the standard deviation, truncated Gaussian, there are no beta values above 1 or very few. So, and no beta values below 0, but probably Gaussian with a sigma of about, I would say 0.2. So standard deviation of about 0.2, or maybe even, 0.3 maybe.
And this is, of course, assuming that this is kind of stable, right? So it's not about beta. An epidemic could not make all our betas some changes that are okay. Maybe.
Well, I do think that beta changes over the life cycle, so that when you're 2 years old, your beta is close to 0, and when you're 20 years old, your beta is close to 0.6, and then it stops improving. Then it stops rising. So it does vary. And I do think that an exciting question for psychologists would be, can you think of ways of helping people achieve higher beta values? Economists, by and large, think of beta as a kind of parameter that is fixed and unchangeable once it stabilizes in adulthood. But it would be such a gift to people if you could intervene either with some kind of psychotropic, pharmaceutical intervention, or some other experiential training that would enable people to, move their betas closer to 1. If you could figure out how to do that, that would be spectacular. But at the moment, we don't know how. And, there's all sorts of speculation. But at this point, it's science fiction more than anything else.
Thanks.
Ida?
Well, thanks. First, I want to thank you for a really clear talk. I didn't think I can understand this equation, but somehow the equation looks so easy to understand when you presented them. And one reason why this is important, some of you know that Israeli TV is starting to work on a show criticizing behavioral economics. So they interview us, Kinneret and me, ask what good had behavioral economics had for the world? What useful was done? And we already start thinking about it. But I think a really good answer is this, well, sometimes you have to force people to do something. This is really mainstream implication. Of course, this idea was in Israel, another country, before it was called behavioral economics, but the idea to force people to save, that is not obvious things if you're mainstream economists. You have to be behavioral economists.
By the way, in Israel, it's 2008, the law. So it's not that old.
No, in Israel, I think it was always a case. You basically had pension.
No, you have to, the law like the right,
No,
or anyway.
No, I think maybe for if you're independent, but if you get salary, I think it was, well, at least I never knew how to take this money off, and I lived before 2008. Okay, so this is really great, a great example of why behavioral economics is important. So, and it's not, and also the limitation of nudge, but there's other ideas in behavioral economics about nudge, and sometimes it's this TV reporter, he's confused. He thinks behavioral economics is all about nudge, but I think this talk really clarifies this issue. But now I want to present a puzzle that bothers me and also Kinneret, and Verity is also here. If people have trouble saving money, why do they save too much junk? Have you thought about this phenomenon? Why my closet is full with things that I don't need? This appears to be the opposite of maybe for some material we have beta larger than 1 in some respect. How do you explain that?
Oh, no, that's exactly what the model would predict, because I have the same problem, and I'm constantly promising myself that I'm going to spend an afternoon cleaning out my closet. But the problem is that requires upfront cost, the half day of unpleasant taking things out, asking myself, what am I going to do with it? Am I going to lose it? Am I going to keep it? I have all this psychological trauma. It's some old shirt that I wore 30 years ago, and I kind of have a love for it, but I should get rid of it. It's taking up space. All of that's unpleasant. So I tell myself, I'll do it next week or next month or next summer. And, I have a whole theory of how I'm going to do all of these important cleaning out things in the future. So it's precisely the procrastination that these models predict.
Okay, thanks. That's very nice. Okay, thanks. If you have anyone else, or I'll ask another question. Okay, Ori.
Wonderful talk. Thanks. So you mentioned that nudges were temporarily effective. So what's the evidence we have for that? So the nice jumps in consumption when people change jobs and so on.
So let me go back. Let me get myself a slide where I've got a little more space. Okay, so I'm going to go back to this. Okay, so here we see, this is a stylized model. It's not quite as clean as all this, but what I could have shown you is some data. Let me put the data over here to the right. So I want to show you down here is income and leakage So if I leak at 100%, then I'm taking all my money out when I leave a job and spending it. If I leak at 0%, I'm leaving all my money in my account when I leave a job, and I'm basically, at least for the short run, preserving it for retirement. This function looks like this. And I could put, $50,000 of income here, annual income. So basically, households with middle and low income are leaking about 70 to 80% of their savings when they leave their employer. So it's this is empirical, right? This is the data. So this is what people missed when they talked about how great nudges worked, because they focused. I mean, some nudges do work. I don't want to suggest all nudges don't work, but when they focused, and myself, I'm as guilty as the rest, we tended to focus on savings at a particular job, and we tended not to look at what happened when you left the job and the money at that point became liquid. When you're working at a firm in the US, the savings is illiquid and you can't really access it. But once you leave the job, you now have the ability to either put the money into a retirement account or leave it where it is or go out and spend it. And it turns out that for the bottom half of the income distribution, the money mostly gets spent. So that's the evidence that the purported great success of auto enrollment, for which I'm in part responsible for talking about how great it is. It doesn't work as well as it appears to work once you start tracking people after they leave their employer and you see what happens to the accumulated funds when they start to become liquid. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's great. But two follow-ups. One is where is this data from? So where can I see it? Or there's a paper on that.
So we're working on a paper right now, which let me just try to clean. Okay, there we go. That's better. So we're working on a paper now where we're going to show you figures like the one I just showed you. But if you want to see work that's related, not exactly what I showed you, but related, there's work by John Sabelhaus and his collaborators, Sabelhous. It's about 8 or 9 years old, where he shows that in the US, for every dollar that goes into the retirement savings system, 40 cents is simultaneously coming out to people under age 55. And the reason that that's even worse than it appears is that a lot of the dollars going in are dollars from rich people. So, if you were to focus on people that are not rich, the leakage rates are even higher than 40 cents on the dollar. So, it's been known for a long time that these systems in the US, not in Israel, where you have illiquid accounts, so it can't come out, but in the US where it's liquid, the money goes in, the money comes out. And that's exactly what you would expect if you're present biased. The nudge, because you're procrastinating and passive, causes you to accept the nudge. But when you leave the firm and now the money's liquid and you've got a lot of credit card debt, well, sure, I'm going to take the money out and spend it or pay off my debts. And of course, I'll build up the debts immediately thereafter once I've paid them off. And
so the second follow-up would be, so in principle, could you just then move the nudge to that decision point once people, so you can just have a default retirement savings account once people leave their jobs? Would that seem to work as well? Or?
That would work, except the money is still sitting in a liquid account at that point. In the US, the penalty for early withdrawal once you leave your employer is only 10%. So if you're borrowing at crazy interest rates, eventually you say to yourself, gosh, it really would be better for me to take the money out of my individual retirement account where it's now sitting and pay off my $30,000 of credit card debt, which I'm paying 18 or 23% on. The only penalty that I pay for taking the money out is 10%, and that's a lot better than a 23% rate of interest. So the money does get drawn out of these accounts, and maybe you would say that's kind of good and healthy because they're paying off credit card debt. Of course, the problem is once they pay off the credit card debt, in the US at least, they build it back up very quickly. So, it's hard to say exactly what should be done, but it's pretty clear that there's a toxic credit market where people are getting into a lot of trouble with debt, and all of the flexibility that we've given people seems not to be creating good outcomes. Now, I'm not quite sure what would be a better outcome. The paper I showed you at the end would argue that maybe more illiquidity would be better, less access to debt. But then critics might say, well, if you shut down people's access to debt, they'll just go to loan sharks and pawn shops. So, David, you're being naive in a different sense of the model by assuming that you can control people's access to debt. They'll just use informal credit markets, and things will be even worse after you get control than they were before you got to implement your policy. So that paternalistic result does assume that we can essentially truly shut down people's access to those funds. But if they can just go out and borrow from a loan shark, it may be that things can't be fixed in a world with present bias until the psychologists figure out how to get people to raise their beta from 0.6 to 1.
You can compare
Okay,
United States to other countries and see what's happened.
Yeah.
In some perspective.
I do think the countries that have mandatory saving do have happier older adults. They certainly have wealthier older adults than the countries that don't. So
yeah, and also a longer life expectancy somehow. United States is surprisingly low in life expectancy.
That's a good point. I'm not sure it's all about retirement saving, but it may partly be about that.
So, first of all, David, thank you so much for this excellent talk. As I promised you some tips for better finance, you just have to increase your beta, as far as I understand. Now, those of you who have to go are free to go, and those who want to stay, if it's fine with you, will stay for about 10 more minutes.
Great.
With the questions.
Great.
Okay. So again, thanks all, and thank you for this talk.
Thanks a lot for inviting me. It was a real pleasure to hang out with you. I've been following a lot of the very terrible events that have been occurring in Israel in terms of the terrorism of the last couple months, and you're all in my heart and in my thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you. Doron, go ahead.
Thanks, and thanks, David. That was a really, really interesting talk. I really enjoyed it. I hope my question would make sense. It's kind of from my psychological perspective. I was wondering, this relationships as you show and the effect of this differences of beta, how much is it related to people's level of disposable income? Or the lower earners, for example, maybe they are the one that drives this effect.
Yes.
Maybe they do not have enough disposable income to meet the needs, their needs. And then it might be that it's not a problem of too much liquid assets. It could be a problem of too little. So you have to spend everything, and you look as if you have a very strong present bias, but you just, I hope that was clear.
Yeah, so I don't think that the spending is in some sense forced on people. And I'll give you an example of why this is not a kind of necessity-driven spending behavior. In the US, when the pandemic came, some people lost their jobs and some people kept their jobs. The people that kept their jobs slightly cut their consumption. The people that lost their jobs in the US raised their consumption. They received government support that was temporary, and rather than living within their old budget, they started spending more because they were temporarily receiving these government credits. So under any kind of traditional notion of rationality, if you've lost your job and you're getting temporary support from the government, you should be cutting your expenditure, not raising it.
Unless you believe that maybe someone will take it if you will not use it, right? So.
Well, that I don't think any Americans believe that. I mean, that's not. I mean,
it's
okay, yeah. So in the U.S., I mean, the government gives you money. They would never come in and demand it back 3 months later. It's unheard of. I mean, maybe it could happen, but no one hypothesizes that that's what's on people's minds. So it looks like it really is a kind of, when I get cash, I spend it, and I spend it even when I shouldn't. And even though I used to be able to live on a lower level of expenditure, the fact that I now have cash lying around is causing me to go on a spending spree, even though it's going to end badly when the government support runs out. And we see that in lots of recent papers. There's work studying what happens when people get fired and they get a lump sum termination payment. They go on a spending spree, but they're unemployed. So all of these examples point to the problem that a lot of this spending seems to be not just driven by true economic hardship, which is definitely a reality in America and around the world, but particularly in America for income, for households with low income, but also it's driven by this beta effect, where if you've got a low beta, you're happy to spend today, even if you're going to have to pay the consequences in the future.
So
sorry. And just the last thing, just to answer your question, it is true that if you measure beta and you measure it against income, and so beta 1, you can see what I'm drawing. Beta 1 is no self-control problem at all, and beta 0 is all you care about is the present. You tend to see patterns like this, where I'm cutting it off at about $100,000 of annual income. So, for households with low income, beta tends to be measured at around 0.4, and for households with high income, beta seems to be measured at around 0.9. So it looks like there is a correlation between beta and income. I don't think that the causality here is clear. I don't think it's that low income causes low beta, but certainly it would make sense that low beta would contribute to low income, because low beta is going to make it very hard to do things like getting good grades, going to college, working late, working on weekends. So low beta would naturally contribute to a lot of the factors that would undercut human capital formation and thereby undercut long-run earnings. But those are theoretical observations, not things that are well understood. The pattern that I've shown you is documented, but the causal channels are not well understood.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I don't see any.
Jackie? Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, thank you very much. This is a very interesting presentation. And I have a question about the operationalization. And you've used the word procrastination, including in the abstract. My research has to do with risk and action. And so I'm interested in terms of the relationship between procrastination and what you would consider action or inaction. So, for example, is procrastination inaction or is it delayed action? And if it's delayed, is it delayed until it's sort of present enough for the actor?
Yeah, so when I say procrastination, what I mean is that your propensity to act is delayed and maybe completely delayed, so it never happens, but at least delayed relative to what you prescribe for yourself as optimal timing. So for example, if I say to myself, you know, I'm really planning to clean out that closet that's full of old junk. I need the closet for the new junk I'm buying. I need to get rid of my old junk. And I say to myself, I'm going to do it this summer. And I say that to myself every year, and 10 summers go by. And then I finally do it on the 11th summer, 10 years late. That would be procrastination, even though I am eventually doing it. But if I never did it, if I kept the out of control closet forever, that would also be procrastination, but it would be worse. How does that compare to your definition?
I guess there's an additional motivation that comes in when you talk about, you know, prescribing it to yourself. So there must be an additional motivation that actually kind of starts that clock, perhaps.
Right.
Does that sound sort of about right?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah, that's right. So in my world, in the world of economics and in the world of present bias, we wouldn't look to a third party to provide a benchmark for what's normative. We would say, you can only procrastinate relative to what you think is normative for yourself. And if you think that, you know, let's say you think that the messy closet is fine, then leaving it a mess is not procrastination. Even if your brother tells you that your closet is disgusting, it doesn't matter. If you think it's fine, then it's not procrastination. But if you say, you know, I'm going to clean this up, and you offer timelines and plans and goals and all these things that you prescribe for yourself, it's only that benchmark that becomes relevant in the definition for me, or for the one that I deploy, for the definition that I'm using.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
There is one question in the chat. Yossi is asking, cannot very high interest rates on savings help?
Yes. So they would help, but they would help a lot more if the government said, we'll give you a 20% rate of return, but only if you lock in the money. The problem is that often these very high rates of return that pull money into these accounts last in their impact for a period of time, but eventually people take the money out. So I think if the government came to me and said, what can we do? Indeed, you know, I've had rare opportunities to advise various governments on these questions. You know, my advice is sure, use high rates of return, but also make the accounts illiquid so that there's a kind of quid pro quo. I'm going to give you the high rate of return, the government says, but in return, you're going to give me agreement that the money will sit there until it's needed because you've either become disabled or you've retired. So that would be the trade I would urge governments to make with their citizens. Thank you.
I will ask the last question and then we will have to end. My question is about the people with low beta. I understand that it's very bad for them, but from the government point of view, because they're spending a lot of money, so basically they're fueling the economy, right? So looking from this perspective, from the government point of view or from the company's point of view.
Well, right. So they're good for the economy during a recession, but they're bad for the economy during a boom. So right now, the people that are spending are making the global economy more congested and more inflated. They're creating, more climate change and more problems for us economically. So, if I could control beta, I'd love to make beta low in a recession, so everyone goes out and spends. And then I'd love to make beta high when we leave the recession, so everyone saves for a rainy day and starts living sustainably, both personally and globally. So low beta, in a nutshell, is only good for society in a recession.
So David, can we end with this tip for governments? As a government, you have to encourage tourists to come to your country with very low beta.
Yes, that's an interesting twist.
Okay, thank you so much. It was very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. It was really fun. Outstanding job.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you. Bye.
Bye.